It has long been a goal of our society to honor all of the men and women of Ozark Airlines, and we hope that this event today will serve as a launching point to record and tell the thousands of stories from each of you and your experiences with Ozark, the best of the original local service carriers. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this trip back in time when a bag of peanuts came from a vending machine. We are lucky to have two films today that will tell the story of Ozark Airlines and the wonderful folks who for 36 years brought sterling service to the flying public with Midwest charm and the feeling that you were part of a big family with a can-do attitude. The first film is The Swallow's Tale, the story of Ozark Airlines, produced locally by Jerry Castellano and directed by Jim Dreyer of Big Sky Media in O'Fallon. And the second film, Ozark Airlines, The Sky's the Limit, produced by Brett Flame and Ozark's Public Television of Springfield, Missouri. In addition to both films, you will get to meet some of the key men who, on a daily basis, ensured that every Ozark flight was on time and fully stocked to provide the very best in passenger comfort. We will see how airline travel today compares to the chef-prepared full-course meals that were a part of most every Ozark trip. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Jerry Castellano, editor of the Silver Swallows newsletter. Jerry, can you introduce the film here?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not like we're not used to delays. Thank you all for coming. It's always fun to meet up with some of our old friends from Ozark. Just a brief introduction to this documentary. It started about 2007. We have an annual Ozark reunion every year. We have for 30 years, and began to realize that we were losing some people that had some unique stories to tell. And it took from that time to 2015 to put together our documentary. And I think that most of us don't look at our daily jobs as being in any way historical. Just it's how we earn money. And I came to realize from the experience of seeing people every year that are no longer with us, and from also talking to younger people, like my next door neighbor who came over one day and said, flying is like going to the DMV. And I said, it really wasn't always like that. And so hopefully that's the story that we've told. So enjoy. Our program today is going to be our first documentary, and after a short break, we're going to come up here with some of the stellar people I think that really made Ozark a very unique environment, a very successful airline, have kind of an informal conversation, and it will be open to questions from any of you. And then we will show the second documentary from Springfield Public Television. So enjoy. Thank you. Bring also Steve Albert. And Steve, the part here I have to read because I can't memorize it. Steve was the supervisor of commissary and cabin services. We have Cliff Day, who was our marketing representative and in charter sales. And last but certainly not least, I think the person who made this trip possible for most of us and most of our careers, Mr. Salvador Cristofoli, who was our director of cabin services and was in fact the person that really I think made Ozark stand out to a great degree. I started with Ozark Airlines in 1978. I was a journalism student. I was getting bored with school. It sounded like it would be a nice diversion to work as a flight attendant. It was kind of a unique thing at that point, being a male flight attendant. And it sounded like fun, take a break from school, and that break lasted for 25 years. And I'll let these people here introduce how they came into the airline business.
I'm not in the airline business.
Well, I was in high school. I was working for a small commuter airline, Golden Pacific, out in California, and working for a travel agency. They weren't paying me anything, but I was flying around the state of California on Beach 99s. I thought that was pretty cool. And the travel agency said, "Well, we can't pay any money, but we'll put you on the list as a travel agent, so you can get these fabulous discounts." So I was flying around the world on travel agent discounts and when I was in high school on traveling fam trips to Hawaii every weekend on Western Airlines in first class, and I said, they really pay you to do this kind of thing? I think the airlines sound good to me, so I couldn't fly as a pilot, glasses, with all the folks coming out of Vietnam with all these hours, so my other interest was food. So airline catering, and it was. So I went to hotel and restaurant management school, and Ozark was the first airline. I applied to every airline in the world that had wings, and Chris was the first one to hire me, so that's how I ended up with Ozark.
I like Jerry was having trouble in school. They asked me to leave. So, and again, I spent 10 years in the 4th grade, so. I got hired by Ozark in the summer of 1977 in field sales in downtown Chicago. And then in the spring of '79, we had just become a deregulated industry. And the powers that be in marketing thought a good idea to spread the name around the country would be to increase charter sales, particularly with ball clubs, political candidates, etc., corporations. So I was single at the time, and I knew a little bit about baseball. Couldn't hit a damn curveball, but whatever. So I was transferred back to St. Louis and into charter sales. The idea was, again, to increase the Ozark name throughout the country. And number 2, it was cash flow, which we always seem to need. In those days, you had to pay to play. And, kind of like Hillary Clinton. But it was cash only primarily, or we didn't fly. So I spent until the year 2001 doing the same thing.
I came out of the school and went into the active duty service 1 year, Truman. They call it Truman's year. And then you took and had 6 years of inactive reserves. So after the end of my first term, I went into, got my freshman year at school, and in 1950, I loved Harry Truman, but he lied to me. I was activated with the Wisconsin Heavy Artillery Unit, went back into the service again during the Korean War, and came out, and a woman that I had dated several times before I went into active duty the second time, I met her and dated her for 3 times, and then I said, this is not the woman for me. And when I came out, I was discharged in May 19th of 1952. And we went out to the Eagles Ballroom, which is a big one in Milwaukee, and where they have big bands came in. And the night I was there, on 29th, was Stan Kenton, who I loved dearly. He was good, had very, very good music, progressive jazz. And as I'm walking out, probably 3 seats to the wind, I heard my name, Chris, and I went over and looked at her. And I seen it was the girl I knew I should have married. And she came over, and I said, you come down tomorrow, and by the end of the summer, we'll be married. We were engaged on June 11th, married on August 30th for 60.5 years. She had to put up with me. I got into the airline by accident. When I came out of the service, I needed money. Korea was not a war, it was a police action, UN police action. So we did not get the educational benefits World War II got. So she went through all this misery. We let 2 of us in bed to get a 1 twin bed for 2 of us. We were so poor. I had a teaching contract, and I said, I need money badly. I'm going to go over and try this new airline that came in, Ozark Airlines. I said, I've never heard of them. And I was hired with the intent that I'll leave at the end of the summer. And I came home and told my wife, I said, this is it now, this is my future. So I stayed with them, and within 16 months, I was made manager in Milwaukee. And in 1962, I was promoted down to St. Louis with an R&D in customer service. And we started the centralized reservation offices. And in about 1964 or 65, we got a new president, Tom Grace. And Tom said, I want to go jets, full jets, and I want to put liquor on the flights. Get a hold of Chris Foley and have him set it up. He's got 3 months. Well, I don't know if you know what it takes to get an aircraft license, dram shop insurance, control, mostly of liquor, and then put the procedures out as well. So I did it in 3 months, and then all along came the big jets, and he wanted to put food on them. So Charlie Mounds came to me and says, I want you to work this out and get it ready. I guess you're going to turn it over to someone else. And I said, geez, I know nothing about food. I said, I know you have to eat 3 times a day to survive. So I got into this thing, and I guess the good man upstairs watching over me, because I came up with some very unusual services. And I was very impressed with Lufthansa. We had German exchange students. My wife and I flew over to spend a week with them. And all of a sudden, I was so impressed. I said, why can't we do this in the States? We can modify it somewhat. And a man by the name of George Crozet was the director of Interline. And I said, George, what can we do? And so he got a hold of the different airlines. And we started out with TAP, the airline in Portugal. And I worked with some very excellent chefs. This is why I think I got my experience. And then we went with Lufthansa, and then we even pushed it a little further. We had 191 flights a day that we were putting food on, coming on 28 stations. And I said, why can't we bring one of their flight attendants over? So George set it all up, and now we have the International Flair Service, serving meals for Swiss Air, everyone but Italian. I'm Italian. And I said, they don't put good food on their flights, so I'm not going to feature them. But we had them all going, and then we had the girls for Premier Aer Lingus. They all came on the first, during St. Patrick's Day, and they'd be in the parade going downtown. And we had, I think the girl from New England, Air New England, stayed the longest. I had to send her back. Steve always in love with Steve when he came over. But all in all, that's how we got off. And then one day, I turned around and I said, I've got to do something a little different. And we came up with what we call a wine cellar in the sky. Wine tasting on flights at off-peak hours, 2 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock at night. And
It was cheaper than a meal service too.
It was cheaper than a meal service. I know that, I guess the attendant came to me one day and he says, what are we paying for that wine? And I said, we're paying $38 a case. He said, we got some good wines out there. I said, that's right. He said, how come only $38 a case? I said, well, I got the idea. I went to some of the vendors and they gave me prices. And I said, I can't pay that price. I said, I'm sorry. I said, I'll dump the program before I go in it. And they said, well, what do we do? I said, well, I'm pouring your label. It's exposing your label to the passenger. Anything over $38, go back to your marketing department and get them to pick it up. And they did. And that's where that was the catalyst that kicked off the wine cellar flights. But I have one incident that I was coming out of Fort Myers, I think it was. And it's time? Oh. And this couple got on the flight, and I was working with the flight attendant in the galley, and she said, get out of here, leave me alone, will you please, just go settle down, don't even talk to me, just get away from me. And so I was standing in the back of the airplane, so I could see the service, how it was going. And they were arguing, well, we made a stop in Sarasota, and then came Sarasota nonstop St. Louis. I didn't pay too much attention, I knew they were consuming a lot of the wine too. And as we got off the airplane, taxied up to the gate, and they started to get up and everything, and she turned around, she grabbed a hold of his hand, she said, "Come on, honey, come on, let's go." And I looked up and I said, "That's one rule meeting." Because they both were, tells you how alcohol sort of rounds off the edges. But that was it, and then we had so many different services that went off at the Wine Basket and Short Hall. And we did put on, I think Tom Reese wanted the hot breakfast to compete with the American and Delta in that Chicago St. Louis market. And I came up with the wine service, the Wine Basket. And then all of a sudden he said, "I want a hot breakfast." And I looked and I said, "He's got to be kidding." We didn't have the space in the galley and and so we finally we took the big tray and cut it in half. We had the vendor make 2 little trays out of the big one. And the only thing that was different on it was that instead of fresh fruit, we put on a cup of orange juice. And we were tearing up that market. I mean, American was losing traffic, Delta was losing traffic. And I think it was Tom Grace that came to my office one day and said, "I got a call from American Airlines, I think it was Bob, no. And so he said to Tom Grace, he said, "What are you doing to us in the Chicago market?" And he said, "Buy a ticket and find out." So he was, this Tom Grace was a great man. We had some great leaders. But I think it was Tom Grace that got us going and got us into the jet area. But I have to say this, we are one big happy family. We still are. So,
For those of you in the audience that didn't experience this, the airline business was entirely different up until 1978. By law, a flight between 2 cities, the lowest price was set by law. So you couldn't compete with price, you had to have something to compete with. And I think that we did a very outstanding, Chris and Steve and the people in catering, did an outstanding job of coming up with some really imaginative and sometimes very elaborate services that we got on the airplane, like the wine cellar flight. And that's really what established Ozark. That and the word family came up with every single person that we interviewed for the documentary. We really did have, no matter what the task was, as some of the stories we're going to talk about in a minute here, that required some real work on the flying by the seat of your pants, no pun intended. You never ran into anyone who said, "No, we really can't do that." It was more like, "Well, we'll find a way to get it done." And to kind of extrapolate from just our normal cabin services, which were excellent. Cliff and Steve can talk about, we had a very great reputation in the charter world for sports teams, as you'll hear from political figures. They knew that Ozark could get it done, whatever it was.
I kind of think the offshoot of the customer service and the terrific charter food service basically was because of these 2 guys. And they just kind of doubled down when the charters came about, and we developed a reputation, particularly with the ball clubs, that we were the gold standard by far. And along with the flight crews that had to serve it, there's one of our best sitting right there. And some of the things that they had to do in a short amount of time was on a charter was rather incredible. There's one particular story I'm going to tell, and I'm going to try to make it short, but since we're in the middle of a political season, so to speak, this one might be kind of relevant. Ozark first put its toes in the water with politics with some guy named Ted Kennedy, you may have heard of him. And we did a few trips with them in 1980, and then something happened that was called Chappaquiddick, and so long story short, the money dried up. And so we didn't get paid. And the Kennedy people had said, oh, don't worry, we're Kennedy's, our money's good. Well, after that thing hit the fan, no more money. So the word came down, you ever do this again, it's wire transfer, no fooling around. So fast forward to 1984, and we pick up Senator Gary Hart out of Colorado, and we flew them probably, what would you guess, Steve, 10 times maybe? Somewhere around there. And then he started to nosedive in the polls. And this was long before Don Rice and monkey business. That hadn't even hit the fan yet. But he wasn't doing well in the polls, so suddenly they go back to Air Bozo. And I think it was an old Ports of Call Convair 880 out of Cincinnati. Still had turbojet motors on it. Chief flight attendant was some young lady named Edna, who the press said was about 90. So they referred to this Convair as Air Edna. And she was all by the book. Well, the press, or the zoo part of the airplane, wasn't in anything by the book. So, anyway, long story short, they're on Air Edna, and they're in Philadelphia. And I'm sitting in the office, phone rings, hi, it's the Hart campaign, we've got a problem. I'm thinking, yeah, you're down the polls, you bet your butt you got a problem, whatever. They said, no, we need to be in San Diego. I said, that's swell. I said, when? They said, oh, this afternoon. So I'm thinking, all right, well. And I digress for just a moment. This goes back to the family issue that Ozark truly was. Because the amount of phone calls that had to be made and how many different departments had to be involved to pull this together in about 40 minutes was pretty incredible. So anyway, the phone's ringing, I'm talking to this guy, he said, yeah, we need to get there. He's got a speech in San Diego tonight. And it's 11 o'clock in Philadelphia, a.m. or something, I don't know what the hell time it was. So I looked at my trusty timetable, that's right, no computers in those days, and saw that we had a commercial, 770, I think it was. 777. 770 something. Yeah, that's right. Air Edna blew up in Philadelphia. One of the engines blew up on rotation, so they're stranded. So I look at the timetable and, aha, 770 is getting ready to push to St. Louis. Called the counter in Philadelphia and got hold of Jay Wilson. So what's the story on 770? 770, how many people on it? He says 19. So where is it? He said, we just pushed back. Said, get it back to the gate. No problem. So he has it pulled back to the gate. Next call, dispatch, Charlie Hornbeck. Greatest dispatcher, charter guy that ever lived. Clifford, what are you up to now? I said, well, I'm going to need a 4-tank DC-9 with -9 power. Where are we going? San Diego. When? 2 hours. Okay, there's one coming out of maintenance. Done. Next call, the genius, right here. Big boy. We're taking Hart to San Diego. And he's going, huh? Where? When? I said, St. Louis to San Diego, you got an hour and a half to put food together. Take it from there when you're into it.
Well, called O'Hare Flight Kitchens, which was a whole nother story. The big boys used to use the Dobbs and the Marriott, so Chris came up with the idea of using the small guys because we were important to them, to a Marriott or a Dobbs. It's Ozark, okay, we'll get to you when we can get to you. We got big boys to take care of. So Chris worked with a VP that retired from Dobbs, and they started this small company called Ozark, called O'Hare Flight Kitchens, who catered only to Ozark. And Sioux City, Denver, Dallas, St. Louis, Chicago, wherever we needed a caterer, we would go in and set up a caterer. At any rate, so called over to Stephanie, who was the buyer, and said, we got an issue here. We need about 80 meals to go to San Diego in an hour and a half. What do we have? And no other charters that day, so it wasn't exactly the charter food. So we started going through the coolers. We had some flare meals, some dessert cart services, and we just cobbled together a wine cellar, and we cobbled together what we could and figured out where we could pack it. And
oh yeah, I called the commissary and had him put on 51 liquor kits and 30 cases of beer to cover. So, Anyway, Steve O'Hare Flight Kitchens pulled this together. And my next call was crew scheduling, saying, all right, we're going to need 4 flight attendants that have been Secret Service checked already. Because Secret Service, they run background checks, etc., as well as cockpit. So crew scheduling said, jumped in and started doing their thing. And then it was time to call the ramp tower in St. Louis, saying, all right, 770's inbound from Philadelphia, it's got the heart campaign on it. Put them on J1. And these were the docks prior to the building of the East Terminal. It was on the east end of Hamlet at the time. And then I said, we're going to tow up a maintenance DC-9, put it on J2, and we're going to run the campaign from J1 to J2. We're off to San Diego. Go ahead.
So, I mean, airport never saw it, no passengers, landed, pulled right into J1, campaign gets off, makes a U-turn right onto J2, and off they go.
We laid it, yeah, and it was, you think about all these departments that were working together in that short amount of time to pull this off. Later on, I think we maybe covered time because of that kind of thing. Later, we also learned that the Senator Hart got up and graciously thanked all the passengers on that commercial flight out of Philadelphia, and he bought drinks. Well, he bought drinks for all the women. But anyway, and then the next day we went on to San Diego, and that was probably set a record for the shortest flight that ever received in-flight meal service. Meal service. San Diego to Burbank. I don't even think they put the gear up.
It was the last trip we thought we were going to have with them because, again, they were running out of money, so they needed us for that leg. We figured, all right, we're going to go out in style because the video police, which was the group in the back of the press, loved us, so they were making it hard for the Heart campaign not to fly us. When they came into St. Louis from Philly, they were going to Cliffy. Hey, Cliffy, good to see you.
Yeah, and those days, again, that was the Washington Press Corps. And they were a different sort back then, as you can imagine. They invented a little deal called sky surfing. And they would sit on the emergency, or stand on the emergency placard in the seat. They'd pull them out and stand on them as the airplane was rotating, up like this, facing aft. And the idea was to see how fast you could surf to the back of the airplane while they had a cigarette in their mouth. Now, we're just taking off, right? They just hoped they didn't spill their beer. That was
Can't tell that to the safety guy. I'm sorry. To the safety guy, can't tell.
Well, yeah, that's right.
No,
There is a statute of limitations, so you're free to disclose anything at this
my
point.
parole officer's right outside, so I can do it.
Jared, can I just inject this here? I never lost sight, and I made sure that my staff never lost sight, that the most important thing on an aircraft was the pilot, of course, but the 1,000 flight attendants we had. And they always keep saying, Chris, you did a good job. No, I'll still say it to this day. You did the job. If I asked for a pot of coffee being brewed before a breakfast flight to set up the atmosphere for the food, they did it. And I have just one thing here. Every time we tried something new, we went to Peg Board and said, Peg, let's try it on the flight. Let's pick up a segment, try it. And it was a wine cellar between St. Louis and Dallas for 1 month. And then at the end of the month, we all meet the flight attendants that had that block and so on in Peg's office. And I went into the room, Peg was there, and I'm not going to mention any names, but there was the 4 flight attendants. And the one came up that was quite unionized and said, Chris, it's a stinking service. It's hard to do. It consumes a lot of time. And I said, here we go, file 13 on that one. And she looked up at me and she said, but Chris, the passengers liked it. Let's go. I got to thank every one of you. You did a damn good job for us. So be full of pride. I think when it signed off, I sent that memo out. I said, I hope you brush off with some of TWA's flight crews because their service was just lousy. So thank you to all the flight attendants that are here.
I think Chris is being a little bit modest because I think part of the whole equation, we could almost study this in a business school. Every corporation, every organization has a personality. And certainly for those of us in the airline business realize that every airline had a very unique identity. And as I just said earlier, we were the airline that we were a family. We could criticize our own fellow employees, but God help if anyone outside the family criticized anyone. And we got things done and we cooperated. And I think one of the more important parts is everyone really cared. We realized how much work it was for these kind of services to be developed, to be implemented. And when someone is giving you something like that to work with, it inspires you. And I think no matter what, I think that from the person who cleaned the aircraft to the people that maintain the aircraft to all of our customer service frontline people, I think that was a hallmark of Ozark Airlines. And that's one of the things that I think, unfortunately, we don't see a lot of these days.
But to add to that, again, the wine cellar, particularly on the Dallas flight, was one of the tougher services. It's a short flight, hour and 18 minutes or less at that time, depending upon the winds. And the official procedures were always written, which got tossed out the window because the flight attendants would get a hold of it and figure out how to really make it work. And one of the things they figured out then was, all right, we've got all these bottles of wine, we'll open those on the ground and stick them back in so that we don't have to start on that after takeoff. Of course, Chris was not like that because once the corks were open, they couldn't be reused. But expediency won out, and that's what used to happen. Corks would be open and they'd be back into their kits for takeoff, and it just sped up the service that much.
There was never much left.
There was one other, I'll be brief here, Jerry. There was another trip. This was for Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro. And we were heading into the March primary season, I do believe. And this is a weather-related story. And we were coming out of the Pacific Northwest. I think it was Portland or Seattle, was it? And we were scheduled to go to Pittsburgh, which was a pretty long haul on a DC-9, but we were scheduled to run it nonstop. And suddenly, before we leave, the campaign goes, ringy dingy dingy, Cliffy, this is the campaign guru. We need to go to Columbia because meaning Missouri, because the polls are tightening in Missouri. So we need to go there first. Then we're going to Pittsburgh. Okie dokie. Next call is the captain and dispatch, and then Steve saying, "Fully airport restaurant." I guess they're making cheeseburgers. So in any case, we take off, and as we're getting close to Columbia, things are getting kind of dicey. I mean, I'm up on the jump seat, and we're starting to see all kinds of things getting painted green all over the radar. In those days, it wasn't color. And so we landed in Columbia, and the tower's getting real nervous. And I had a real senior captain by the name of Bob Harrison, and a guy, a first officer on his first trip. And this kid was so young and new, his damn hat didn't fit. And the bill was here. You could never see the guy's damn eyes. It's like, holy. Harrison's like, okay, this is going to be swell. In any case, we started getting all these, National Weather Service dire warnings. And tornado watch went into tornado warnings, and the sky is doing the Dorothy from Kansas crap, Tower says, we're getting the hell out of here. And Big Bob Harrison goes, no, you're not, because we got to get out of here. And the video, all the media guys in the back of the plane suddenly they're all very quiet. And imagine this, they were fastening their seatbelts. They were like, this could be interesting. So, Tower clears us to go at Columbia Regional, and they get the hell out, they evacuate. So we taxi out to the end of the runway, and Bob Harrison turns this damn DC-9 at a 360, but the radar pointed straight up. And I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here? And he goes, I know where I'm going. Called the tower back. I guess one soul remained. Said, give me this heading, and we're going to Pittsburgh. You could have heard a pin drop where all the animals were in the back of the airplane. I mean, these guys were not saying a word. So they clear us to go, we take off, not a ripple, not even a bump. And all these press guys in the back of the airplane just lose it. They're all cheering, they're chanting, Ozark, Ozark, Ozark. Anyway, it was just kind of a fun story, but I'm not really damned because she lost too, so you know.
To carry that one further, that's why I knew it was Seattle. I got a call from United, and they said, would you mind if we put our chef on board on, what was her name? Yeah, Ferraro. And I said, no, God, I'm not paying any overtime. He said, no, we got to get him back to Chicago, and he can take your flight into Columbia, and then wherever, and then he comes back to United in Chicago, because that was their corporate. And then when he got there, he gave me a call when he got back to his base. And he said, you know, Chris, he said, I don't know if she'll make a good VP. And I said, well, what made you say that? He said, I was on board and getting ready to serve her, and she was crying and crying and crying. And I tried to talk to her, and he said she wouldn't respond. Evidently, the press or someone had gotten a hold of her, and they were investigating her mother and father, and she wasn't taking it too well. And he said, I was just wondering how she would react if a crisis hit us, and she was VP. So that's why I knew she came out of Seattle.
Well, and what that crisis turned out to be was some of the press people had determined that her husband was considered to be at the time a bit of a slumlord in the New York City area. Now, whether how much of that was true or not, I don't really know, but I recall that, and she was very, very upset, and I think probably with good reason.
I think that and her parents say, you know, I don't know why, I can't even stand watching TV today because everything is negative, and negative back. And you can get a lot more when you make someone laugh. And that's why I always try to sit there and compliment the flight attendants all the time, because, you know, it doesn't do any good to be negative on something. And if they know, I was criticized. I was brought up before my VP, and he said, Chris, you're creating a problem for some of these directors. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, you can't have everyone call you Chris. And I said, that's right. I said, I do this for a purpose. And he said, what's the purpose? I said, if they had to call me Mr., I said, I already built a wall there. I said, by being Chris, I'm one of them. And they can solve a lot of problems for us because they're in the trenches. And that's how I got the Army gave me the name Chris, and then it was always Chris with everyone else. Even the vendors used to say oh, I knew Mr. Christopherly, I'm going to see him. He said, you knew who? He said, Mr. Christopherly. He said, no, his name is Chris. Just call him Chris. But you know, that's a philosophy. No matter what level we are, what we had to do in our responsibilities, it's always good to sit there and talk to people on their level, because you learn something every time they speak.
That's what people go to 2 years of, to get a master's in business administration to learn what Chris just talked about. You know, they always, nowadays the buzz phrase is to bring the level of decision down to the person who actually has to do the job. And as a flight attendant, Chris's office direct number was in our manuals. If we had a problem with something somewhere, we were supposed to call Chris's office. If it was business hours, we'd get a hold of him, or we would leave a message, and that's exactly how things got done.
The next morning, I'd be on an airplane to sit here wherever it was to find out what the heck was going on.
I used to say, better you than me. Because I enjoyed my family and I wanted to be home as much as possible, I fly out to San Diego and check the kitchen, and I could fly back in one day. And by the time I get landed in St. Louis, I felt my eyes 5 inches out of my head, because I was 7.5 hours in the air and trying to get back home again. And of course, Stephen was my wife. She'd always give Stephen the best of everything, you know. And my daughters adopted him as a brother. And my wife said one day, she said, he's like a son to us. And I looked and I said, please, Millie, speak for yourself. But we always had a lot of humor, and Steve was always there and with the family, still is. And of course, my wife passed away 3.5 years ago, and I lost a daughter in February this year. And he's always there calling me and saying, how you doing? And so on. And I think that's what everyone does. That was with Ozark. They always want to know how the other person's doing, and you can bank on us anytime. And so we are family.
If you remember long ago, when you bought a Cardinals ticket, on the back was an advertisement because Ozark Airlines was the official airlines of the St. Louis Cardinals. And that was not the only major sports team and college sports team that we carried. And my favorite story that I'll ask Steve to tell is the weekend charter to Charleston. The wrong Charleston. Was it Charleston?
What? No.
The sports charter. You took off to the wrong destination.
Oh,
Well, there was more than one of those.
that was an actually. Yeah. And we were going to Charleston where they were playing their one of their farm teams, and the traveling secretary turned to the charter up, a different one than Clinton, and said, so you guys want to come to the game? So you fly in and play the game, and then go on to the next station back to play the majors. It was Pittsburgh or something. And Max said, no, we're not going to go to the game. We're going to the beach instead. And
Whoops.
traveling secretary kind of looks at him, gets this curious look on his face, and says, to the beach? Yeah.
Oh, God, interrupt 1 second. You remember the traveling secretary for the Astros? Donald Davidson. He's 3'2". The guy literally was about that tall. And his business cards were that big. And he'd wear this 10-gallon cowboy hat, and he could cuss like...
So anyway, he says, well, that's a couple hours away. How are you going to get over there and get back? Matt gets this kind of concerned look on his face. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, Charleston's in the middle of the mountains. And Matt goes, Charleston where?
Charlie West.
Charleston, West Virginia, and we were planning to go to Charleston, South Carolina. So in midair, there comes a little left bank, and we landed in Charlotte, West Virginia, and I go to the airport caterer, who was just closing. It was a Saturday afternoon. And I said, wait a second, you guys busy? He said, no, we're closed. We're going home for the weekend. I said, no, you're not. How would you like to cater an airplane for the Houston Astros? Again. All right, let's open the coolers, see what we have, let's see what we can put together. Yeah, that was, there was another Charleston, West Virginia one with, going into Huntington, West Virginia, that little airport. United had been in there, so we had to go into it. It was a foggy day.
It's Gary Hart again.
See, what charter was it that went down to Mexico City, and they had a mechanical, and they got it repaired, and they had a noise abatement. No flight could take off after midnight. And so what happened, the captain locked it all up and started taxiing out. They told him to come down back. He couldn't take off. This is the story I heard. I'm not too sure how much it was true. And they said, the tower said, you'll have to come back. And the Mexicana trip was in front of him, ready for takeoff. And he said, follow me. And they actually were supposed to fly from Mexico City to Houston until they got over to the American territory. From the blinking lights, the flashing red lights, and they followed Mexicana to Houston. So it's I'll tell you, we had fun. I think that's the nice thing about this all. We all had fun.
I can vouch for that. I was on
Oh,
it.
yeah?
And then there was another trip into Mexico, and if we're getting low on time, just say, done. Okay. We're good. We're into Ixtapa, which is the airport, well, it's a lot named for Ixtapa. And it was a brand new airport, and it was a really nice facility, but it was very small. And this was one of our first forays into Mexico. And we had signed a large tour package with a company called Adventure Tours out of Dallas. Anyway, this was the first trip from St. Louis down to Zlotnio, when we were to fly empty back to St. Louis. So we land, Petey McHugh's the captain. We're taxiing into the gate, and we're just kind of carrying on, talking about, no doubt, nothing good. And there's a Pan Am 707 sitting on the tarmac with one of its cowlings up. And we get into the little gate operations area, and I'm paying the fuel bill, and Pete's getting his dispatch paperwork and whatever, what have you. Suddenly these people in the gate start going, Ozark, 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 what are you doing down here? Help us, help us, help us. Well, as it turns out, the Pan Am 707's got a mechanic. But anyway, this Pan Am captain with his British lilt accent and the white hat and the word Pan Am says something to McHugh about, what the hell's a little bitty Ozark doing down here, mate? Something like that. McHugh says, hey, bonehead, at least my DC-9 starts. Long story short, these folks in the gate were St. Louisans. So I made a call to dispatch, called my boss, said, what do you think? Looked at Petey, he's going, what the hell am I? I ran over to the Pan Am 707, and their flight attendants were great. They said, take whatever you need, Cokes, Pepsi's, booze, and I'm taking all the booze. What the hell? They're like, save us enough for the beach party since we're suddenly not going home tonight and not flying. So anyway, we loaded up and off to St. Louis we went.
You know, I used to love to come in on Monday, and I hated to see a Friday come, because we always had so much fun. And this kid here over here, Stephen, he could upset anyone, and he had something going with my secretary, I have no idea. But she would say, Stephen, and poor Stephen, I'd have to go out there and bring peace between the two. And he had, I'll tell you, I think Dick Hannon called me in so many times because what is Stephen up to now? I wouldn't even have to ask why I was going in there. I just go and say, what's Stephen doing now? And, but he did put so many good hours in. When I first hired him, it was about 3 weeks later. I was sorry I did, because I was getting all these calls on my hotline for the flight attendants saying, who's this kid you hired? He's a pain. And I finally found out what was happening is when they were taxiing out, she was giving them the announcement. Stephen was doing some classical things in the galley area, and she would break up and laugh all through the announcement. And I guess that's why they finally they did take to him. They wondered who the kid was with the banky haircut that I hired.
Actually, what that was, I forget who taught me that trick, but we'd stand in the galley as you're taxiing out. Of course, passengers couldn't see, but the PA was in the entryway, so they'd be on that and stand with their back to them with a little cup of water and just kind of pour that on the floor of the galley. Yeah, there were stunts like that. Speaking of which, wait, Chris, tell the story of Milwaukee and the DC-3 and the race that we used to have.
I don't know, it's sort of racy, but
No, the race between the two airlines.
oh, when I was manager up in Milwaukee there, we were subcontract to American Airlines, and they had a large air freight handling up there, about 1 million pounds a month that we shipped by truck down to Chicago. But we found out that we were so good, my grandparent people and so on, that American Airlines said, you handle these things just well as far as diversion of flights because of weather. So I'm sitting up there, cold, my nose is running and freezing at the same time. We hadn't eaten for at least 10 hours because of American. They had 2 Boeing 707s on the ground, a 80, I think it was, the humpback, and then there was another aircraft. And we were starting to crank them up because American was going to divert them so they could pick up another trip. And this guy comes up with a little Apache or something and parks right behind the 707. And I said, sir, you're going to have to move your 707. I'm not going to mention what he said to me. And I looked over, the guy was cranking up, was going to crank up the engine with a fire extinguisher, and I went like this. And they started winding up that 707. That man came halfway down the steps, ran for his airplane, and taxied it out of the way, because when they pulled power, that Apache was going to go across the field. But, you know, when you're cold, and you're hungry, and you're tired, you know, there's things that you do, and you have no patience at that point. But there's so many stories that we have. I had to tell the flight attendants, I said, you know, why don't you all get together and set up a book? Because there's so many stories. There's the one with the guy coming out.
Because they're all illegal, that's why.
They had one coming out of Las Vegas, the red eye. And this Maureen said that this guy was coming out, and he went to the bathroom, that was it. And he was in there. Half an hour passed, and she said, I'm going to have to key that and get him, see if he's okay in there. Well, he comes out in a buff. He washed all his clothes because he was sick. And he was hanging them over the back of the seats of the airplane in the back there. And she turned around, she said, just a minute, sir. She ran and got the blankets for him real quick. She didn't want to go down. But there's so many stories that you kids would tell, and it would be a number one, believe me, a number one.
One of the reasons we didn't have any photographs was the fact that we've taken too much time to put the black bars over everyone's eyes so no one could recognize it.
Actually, what I was trying to get to tell was a story in the DC-3 days. I guess Ozark had a flight that went to one location, and there was another, who was it, Lake Central or somebody else? Capital had a DC-3 going to the same place at the same time.
Oh, that's Capital Airlines, yeah. What was his name? The one that helped build Airlines.
Doesn't matter.
Captain. No, it was with Ozark. He started, he paid all his money as well. Glenn Schaefer. It was Glenn Schaefer. And he came up to me and says, Chris, I got a bet with this guy from Capital Airlines. They had DC-3s too that flew across Lake Michigan. He said, I want that aircraft fully loaded, one engine going because the first officer was on board. He said, and there's two branches in Milwaukee. One went off the Capital Airlines terminal, the other one to North Central and Ozark. And we had the furthest escape. He said, at a certain time, we're going to take off. He's going to go his way, I'm going to go my way. And we'll see who gets off first, because I evidently had a bet. And by God, we got out there, and I got a call from the tower, and he said, who in the hell is on 17 tonight? I said, Glenn Schaefer, why? He said, he took off, and he said he taxied out real quick and took off, and he flew about 20 feet above the ground through the whole length of the 10,000-foot runway, and just at the end, he pulled that DC-3 up, he said, with the nose straight up, and he said, yeah, I never knew you could do that. But I didn't know that Glenn Schaefer worked for the English aircraft builder, the California aircraft builder. And during the war, he was a test pilot. And he was the only pilot that had taken a DC-3 and rolled it. Because they said of the wing structure, it could not be done. But Glenn was known for it. We had one person came up the gate and up to the ticket counter, "Who's flying tonight down to Peoria?" I say, "Glenn Schaefer." He said, "Well, thank you." He went next door to North Central from Chicago. Took a flight out to Peoria, out of Chicago. But Glenn would taxi out, and I think another Captain York, Will York. And first time I flew with him, I thought it was a P-30, it was a P-30 or 38, and he just banged it like this, and your stomach went down, and then he'd land and pull up the gate, and before the first passenger got off that airplane, he has a bag in hand. He was the first one off the airplane. But we had a bunch of good people that we worked with and so on, and I would love to go back and do it all over.
I just saw you.
Oh, we had the Brickoff twins. I don't know if you ever remember them. They're from Germany. They spoke German fluently and very keen with the American language. But anyways, one was flying a DC-3 on one trip, and the other was flying a DC-3 on the other trip. And they both came together at Cedar Rapids. And they held the one flight for a passenger coming off to get onto the one other flight to continue. And this passenger picked up his coat, hat, and everything, and ran like a son of a gun for the other airplane, crawled up the airplane and looked at her and said, "How the hell did you get here before I did?" But we always had fun. We always had a lot going, and I'd relive that same thing all over again. It's been a good life.
Any questions from the audience?
Yeah,
You, sir.
I'd like to hear if anybody has any experience at 9/11 when we had 5,000 craft in the air and they had to land within. If there's anybody here that can talk about that, we'd like to hear the experience there.
I remember driving to the OGO headquarters that day, and they had the TV on, and a few days later, it was when during the grounding, it was just such an eerie feeling, not hearing any jets in the sky at all. That's all I can.
I was working at that time for Transworld Airlines in the safety department as an instructor. And I remember I was teaching that morning, and on breaks come in and you'd hear things bit by bit. And we called it the war room. It was a conference room. And they monitored all the flights. And I knew, in fact, some of my friends who were crew members at the time were diverted, in many cases not knowing the reason why. You know, some of the lucky people were able to tell air traffic control that they were, say, 20 minutes out of St. Louis, instead of going to Champaign-Urbana, we can get on the ground just as quickly and get to our destination. But a lot of people wound up for days, and more or less, probably grounding the aircraft was the easy part. In fact, you can see, I think, on YouTube or online, a video of it looks like several funnels where the dots all just go around and disappear. But the big logistical problem was, our crew members just rented cars. They got home. We had airplanes in one place. We had crew members, God knows where they were, because they were no longer, I think starting the whole thing back up was probably a lot more problematic. Don?
We were told in flight to go to the nearest suitable airport. If you told them an airport you wanted to go to, they'd clear you there. We talked to them later. All they wanted to know was, are you in command of your flight?
Thank you. Someone else? Yes.
Just a sidebar comment I wanted to throw in here from a guy who's not an Ozark person, but an aviation historian. Been following Ozark ever since I came to St. Louis in 1968, way back then. And that is that something that comes through loud and clear to me from all of you guys up here, and the story that I'm hearing, is that one of the essential ingredients of the Ozark success is what I call a can-do attitude.
I think that's very true, and I think, as you can also hear from these stories, standardization was not our strong suit. And as I like to say, when I look at a lot of our coworkers at reunions, I look around at myself as well, and I think, if they'd had psychological testing back in the day, a lot of us probably wouldn't have gone there. Another question back there, yes.
A question for Bill or absolutely. A while back, Jerry and I have worked together on some projects before, and I was looking kind of for my next project to do, and Jerry had approached me with the idea about Ozark Airlines, and I was familiar with Ozark Airlines. I had the pleasure of being a Cub Scout and getting my junior pilot's license. I believe it was the DC-3. It scared the hell out of me. I don't think I flew for about 2 more years after that. But Jerry approached me about it, and I was definitely intrigued. You know, I come from a generation that's, I would call it the flip-flop sweatpants kind of flying experience. It's, you know, it's just more or less about getting to your destination. And I started looking through some of the pictures, and I was just so amazed. I mean, you can't hardly get people to put socks on now, but there was these people in 3-piece suits and dresses, and you know, it seemed to me that the journey was almost as fun as the destination. So I was just really intrigued by that, and you know, working with Jerry and interviewing these great guys, you know, I learned how much the company actually meant to the city of St. Louis. You know, that's a rarity nowadays. So, you know, just being able to learn all about the way things were and how it has changed, it was just so intriguing to me. And you know, Jerry kind of guided me through the process. He was my historian and made sure we were showing the right planes when we talked about them in the documentary. So it was just a great experience to see how this airline has, you know, touched all of you and, you know, especially the city of St. Louis too. So I hope I did you all justice.
Yes, you did, sir. And I think the team's perspective was very important because, as I said, you don't think of your job, even at this late a date, almost 40 years after I started. I went on my very first, my only interview with Ozark Airlines exactly 39 years ago yesterday, and started in early 1978. And still, when we're among each other, it doesn't seem very remarkable, and it takes the perspective of someone from the outside to look at it and think, this is almost like science fiction. People are actually, you know, dining off of China and having cocktails and reading big hardback books. And it was a different era, and I think that's one of the more important aspects is to have someone like Jim who can contrast it, and it almost makes it easier to tell us. It does make it easier to tell the story.
I make it a point to dress nice when I fly now. So.
I remember some stories.
Yes.
Flight attendants can back me up on this. When you're a new hire, they used to often play practical jokes on you. And I remember a particular story. I wasn't around, but it was one of our senior captains, and there was who is now a very senior flight attendant. It was her first trip on a DC-3, and in those days, you had to serve every leg, at least beverages. This was before the food service, but on the DC-3, they served beverages every leg, didn't matter how long or how short it was. And this particular leg was Decatur to Champagne, which is just really, just literally up on top. And so on takeoff, the captain calls the flight attendant to come forward and says, no, don't alarm the passengers, but we have a fire on the left engine. I want you to go back and bring me a cup of water. So I went back, got a cup of water, brought it forward. He opens the sliding window, because it can't get this far off the ground, throws it out, looks back there and says, didn't go out, go get me another one. So for the length of this 10-minute flight, this flight attendant's running back and forth to the cabin with a cup of water. And I'm sure the passengers are going, my goodness, that's a thirsty cup. Who the heck is going on here? So just on the final approach, he says, okay, go back, take your seat. It's out, we're fine, don't worry about it, go back and take your seat. And they went on through the rest of the day, and hopped, and then they're having dinner somewhere that night, and the captain turns to the flight attendant and says, you know, I just wanted to tell you, you did a beautiful job of that incident we had today. Quite proud of you, and you're going to be a great flight attendant. She said, well, I was really kind of concerned about that. He said, well, what's that? I said, well, we have to serve our passengers in every leg, and I wasn't able to serve our passengers on that leg. He said, oh, don't worry about that. Anybody says anything to you, I'll take care of it. She said, oh, I'm not worried about it. I wrote up a report 3 stops ago and sent it in.
Well, I kind of have a comment. My dad was maintenance supervisor, second shift, and he worked second shift, so we didn't get to see him as kids growing up all week. We'd live for the weekend when we could see Dad, because he was, working nights. And I just wanted to kind of, I remember his boss was Meese. I don't remember his first name. What's his first name? Ed Meese. And I remember when the phone would ring at our house and it was Mr. Meese. A hand went up and everybody in the house knew not to say a word because he had to listen to what was going on, because he usually was being called into work, or he was being called to go to another city to change an engine. There are a lot of times when Dad had to fly all over the country to go help, with engine changes. I remember what you were talking about with clothing. When we, Ozark afforded our family the opportunity to take trips. We didn't have a lot of money, but we could go for a day or two because we could fly cheaply, and we had to wear our very, very best clothes on those trips, to go on those trips. And, Ozark was a great place for my dad to work. He was there from the first month he started until TWA bought him, and retired only because he had to, because there was no place he loved more than being with those airplanes and you people and doing what he did.
With the flight attendants, there's so many stories going around when we fly to DC-3s, and one of them was, I guess in my 80s, it takes a while before someone is registered when it comes to names. But there was a captain and first officer, and it was a DC-3, and they were loaded here in St. Louis. The cargo bin was right in the rear portion of the aircraft. And they getting ready to go, and the captain said, "Where's my first officer?" And he said, "Well, isn't he up there?" And he said, "No, I haven't got anyone up there." And he said, "Well, you're going to have to go." And he said, "Well, he said, "Fine, just button it up, we're going to go." Well, in the meantime, as soon as that the stairs are pulled up and locked, first officer came around and shoved him in the cargo bin with his coat and everything else. And it was going from St. Louis to Springfield. So when it got off in Springfield, of course, the captain called ahead of time and said, "Take him out of the cargo bin." And they had it set up so he'd be on the other side of the aircraft when they're unloading the passengers. And then all of a sudden, when the plane was empty, the guy was running around, white scarf, long coat, and carrying his flight kit bag, and going, "Wow, I didn't think I was ever going to catch up with you." And I feel so sorry for you, because you were fresh meat at the time when I say, that you believed anything that they said in the cockpit. And there's so many stories. That's what I'm saying. Stories like that would make a bestseller. And then there was another one where I think it was Mrs. Mounts was one of our VPs. And this one first officer at that time, became a captain later on, was a jokester. And he came back, he says he's going back and use the restroom. And he's walking down, and he's got a book open, and evidently he set it up this way and says, "How to learn to fly in 10 easy lessons." It sort of shook up the passengers for a while.
Who is that?
I can't remember who, but the guy, the one that was carrying the book, or no, the one that ran around the corner there, he was killed. He was a Corvette, Willie Polite. He was the one there, and I think it was Willie Polite also that walked down the aisle while the flight was in flight. With a book that said, "Learn to fly in 10 lessons, easy lessons."
And the stinker would come on board with a white cane and dark glasses, and he would come on board with a freaking bag full of nuts and bolts and drop them underneath the cockpit door as you were taking off. Drive you crazy. Or make you flush the honey bucket every time somebody went to the bathroom.
See, you had a winner. If someone would have taken it and did something with these stories, really, because there are so many stories. I think that's why we loved the airline, because you could be upset with one person at one time, But no matter how upset anyone got you, you always come back and say, I'm doing it for the company. Doesn't mean I have to go in the bar and have a drink with them. I'll do it for him and the company. And that's why, when you said can do, being a Korean vet, at armistice time, a lot of the schools call us in, and we have different veterans come in from different war eras. And one of the kids, a Korean kid, about 400 or 500 students, and he came to me and he said, "What did you learn when you were in the service?" And I said, "Well," I said, "I thought you were a second." I said, "You know, I think what I really learned was I took the word can't out of my dictionary." And I think that's why we knew our limitations at Ozark, but we were a can-do. We never said it can't be done.
Sir?
Does anyone have a list of employees that takes service? A comprehensive list of everyone who ever worked for Ozark Airlines? Is that kind of a list?
I don't even know if that would exist. I know I have a list of the flight attendants at the time of the merger with Transworld Airlines, but that was only the active flight attendants. And you have to remember, again, going way back into the past, most of the average stay of flight attendants was about 12 to 18 months because you couldn't be above a certain age, you couldn't be married. There were so many circumstances, and it was, the turnover was amazing. As you can tell, the practical jokes were kind of a standard fare, and we did have one particular captain who really went out of his way to have some pretty elaborate practical jokes. And my favorite one is related to me by a first officer flying with him on the Fairchild, which was a propeller aircraft. He had 4 propellers on each side. And he had constructed a magnetic piece of metal that looked as if the propeller had struck an object and the object was now lodged on the propeller blade. And so when they would arrive at an overnight, he would either do this or have a mechanic arrange to put that on the blade and rotate it to the top. So the next morning when they would come out, and he would have this all, everyone at the station was in on the joke, and the first officer's job was to walk around. And so they, one by one, examine the blades for any nicks, and of course this thing would come down, and here's this metal mess on the prop. And go inside, and the captain would say, "Oh, we got to call dispatch, we have to cancel the flight," and all this. And as they were having a conference, he said, "Well, you know, I kind of seem to recall this happening before." And he goes, "Let's look at it," and what we just did was, and they would pull it off. So a friend of mine had heard this story before, so he goes one up and sees this object on the propeller and simply takes it off, puts it in his suitcase. And he said, "You know, we flew 3 days, and he never mentioned this once until we got back to St. Louis." And he said, "I'd like to have that back." Any other questions?
I was just gonna ask one quick question on food service. Out of New York one time, the plane wouldn't get off the ground for some reason, so they switched us all to another plane. And we were all starving anyway because we didn't eat all day. And halfway to St. Louis, they said we had a beautiful supper on that first plane, but it was against the law to switch the steaks from one plane to the other. Is that true, or were they just blowing smoke at us?
Blowing smoke. I think what would be critical there would have been the amount of time it was out of refrigeration or something.
See, with charters, if they're outside the continental boundaries of the United States, the charters had to make a stop at the first American city that they could go to. Houston was the big one, because the garbage, uneaten food, or eaten food, or whatever, they had to take and put it into a certain water supplies that are storage. It has to grind it up very fine, and then it's pushed into the sewer system.
That's the international.
That's on the international.
Yeah, but this is a local flight, I forget what airline, but my guy, he said we had a beautiful supper and all them people, we didn't eat all day.
Probably what it was they had another airplane and they couldn't get a hold of a caterer to swap it.
No, he said it was all in the first plane, so they're gonna throw all that away. I still remember that.
Nope.
They had to find somebody to move it, and
Yeah.
they didn't want to.
If the
Yeah.
caterer didn't have a truck that could get it moved in time, they'd say, just leave it,
You
let
had
it
to
go.
You had to watch out for the unions. I know one time one day, the vendor was sitting to something cool at in the Fairchilds, and these guys were unloading it rather slowly, and I had to get back real quick to the office, and I went and grabbed the box and everything, and by the time I got back to the office, they were going to file a grievance against me because I reached in and grabbed the box so I could get back, and then of course, I think that Peg and I think Cookie was her name, who was a trainee, and they said that we had to watch ourselves. I was a qualified flight attendant because I would fly and watch how things were doing and everything else, but I never served the customers. And someone asked me, "Why didn't you serve them? Carry it through." And so I just didn't want the people, the passengers, to look at me and say, "Jesus, those aren't that hard up here. Hire an old man." And so I never went past the galley when I flew in there. And we did it when we were trying to test out the meal services. But someone said, "How did you ever get FAA clearance?" I said, "Because I had to go up there and test the meals before the pilots ate them."
Yes, you, sir. That's your last question.
I've always wondered, does anybody know whatever happened to the big collage mural that was in the lobby of the OTO? Beautiful painting.
No, I think it was a maintenance.
I think, is it a version of what's on the poster over there?
No, it's not that one. It was a big color collage mural in the lobby of the headquarters building, the OTO.
No, all I
It was
remember,
briefly shown in the movie for like a split second.
all I remember from the last days of Ozark were crew members who were literally taking the three-dimensional large letters off the, and employees off the wall because it was like it was a keepsake, I guess.
I was trying to tow a DC-9, it didn't work so well.
Well, one more, okay.
Tell the story about the last DC-3 flight. There is a story connected. Did they keep any in reserve just in case they needed something as a backup, perhaps? What was the story then?
I just know the last, I believe it was 1967 was the last DC-3 flight. And of course, there again, I can picture, in fact, a photograph of two people in front of DC-3 were the crew members who flew, the pilots who flew the last DC-3 flight. I don't know what the destination was. Pardon? No, Glenn lived in Florida. So there we go. I can remember where he lived. He retired in Florida. He grounded his sailboat. Because you can't teach a pilot how to sail.
Jerry? Don Lochner.
That was it, yes. And I can't think of who the first officer was in the picture. But yeah, Don Lochner. Yeah. Except when they said that, he didn't believe when he said the water's really shallow for it.
Hey, D'Angelo?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall me giving you a fleet listing of all the disposition of the Ozark DC-3s, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, I have that.
Some of that information might be what that gentleman was looking for, because I know that it was, a lot of that was pretty well spelled out in that thing.
It was, yeah, it covered it real well.
Well, I would like to thank these gentlemen up here for joining us.
Jerry, will you or your collaborator care to make a comment about the role of Oliver Parks and Parks Airlines in the start of flight operations in Ozark?
I don't know that much about it, but he's the person who essentially, if you go on and you Google Living St. Louis Ozark Airlines, in 2007, Jim was busy with another project, and I got Pat Murphy from KETC to send a crew out to just videotape our reunion. And Rich Roberts, who was responsible for a lot of things at Ozark and very responsible for keeping the legacy of Ozark Airlines going. He passed away in 2011. Talks about the fact, I don't know if this is one of these apocryphal stories, that we got our first DC-3s from Parks Airlines, and all they had to do was paint over the P and put the OZ in front. But it was a very substantial part of what would be the second 1950 start.
It was very difficult to find parks-related photos and things too to come back. I should have called you.
Anyway, Jim Dreyer, Steve Albert, Cliff Day, Salvador Cristofoli. We're going to take a short break and